I guess everybody is on spring break already. Where is everybody? Right. Okay, so if you haven't picked up your quiz yet, I have it in my office. Why? Because the corporate finance quizzes had to go out yesterday. I couldn't get the two mixed up. So if you haven't picked up the quiz, there's no choice but for you to come into my office and ask for the quiz. So think of that the next quiz when you don't pick up your quiz, right? It'll end up with me. Couple of things. One is have fun over spring break, but catch up on your valuation first, right? So do it at least. Work from now through Friday, get it all out of the way so it's out there. Today we're going to have some fun. Not like we don't have fun. At least I have fun every session. But today's class is going to be really fun because it's going to be the class where I connect stories to numbers. Remember I talked about this at the very start of class about how valuations were bridges between stories and numbers? So what's your due date for your DCF? I forget now. It's 2 Fridays from now or something like. No. So here's what's going to happen is those of you who are going to submit your DCFs are going to send me spreadsheets of your company valuations, right? And you expect me to give you feedback like your growth rate should really be 23.2%, not 25.5%. Don't expect that kind of feedback. Because here's what I'm going to do when you send me your DCFs. I'm going to reverse engineer from your DCFs the story you're telling about your company. And then I'm going to ask you, do you like that story? And if you say no, I'm going to say that's what you've told me in the valuation. You see? So what are you talking about? Let me give you an example. We're going to do the start of the class test today around a structure. Let's assume that I have done a valuation of a company. And here's what I put into my valuation. A 50% compounded annual growth rate in revenues for the next 10 years. I've assumed an operating margin of 20%, much higher than the industry average. And I'm also assuming low reinvestment in the company. In other words, they can get this growth with very little reinvestment and a cost. So when you look at the spreadsheet, you see 50% growth rate, 20% margin, low reinvestment, low cost of capital. It's all numbers, right? Now I'm going to ask you to flesh out the story that must be behind my numbers. And with each choice, I want you to tell me what my company must. So you're going to guess. You don't even know the name of the company, something about my company. Is my company a small company or a big company, you think? And what is it that makes you think it's a small company? I put a 50% growth rate. Do you think the total market I'm looking at is a mature market or a growing market? It's probably going to be a growing market because even small companies in mature market, so it's probably a small company in a growing market. Do you think the company I'm valuing is a company with strong competitive advantages or weak competitive advantages? And why do you think it's strong? Because the growth rate is really high. No, the growth, any company even with low competitive advantages can grow. What is it I'm assuming with the growth? My operating margin is high. What does that mean when the operating margin is high? You charge higher prices than everybody else, and the only way you get away with it is if you have a strong competitive advantage. And am I in a capital-intense business, a low capital-intense business, or a high capital-intense business, you think? And what is it that makes it low? Because my reinvestment is low. And finally, do you think I'm selling products and services that are discretionary or non-discretionary? You see, what does that even matter? We already talked about betas. we talked about one of the factors that drives your beta is your product or service discretionary, right? If you produce a luxury good, usually you're discretionary, so what happens? Your beta goes up, your cost of equity goes up, what am I assuming about cost of capital? Much lower in the market, so the product or service I must be providing must be a non-discretionary product. So let's assume that I then lift my hands off the name of the company and you say it's Microsoft. You know what I'm going to send you as a response to your DCF? It's not that your growth rate is wrong, because I have no idea, but this story doesn't fit the company you've just described on your spreadsheet. Every one of your spreadsheets is telling a story. And you might as well be explicit about the story with yourself, because if you're not, I'm going to be. And I'm going to ask you, is this the company that you really tried to value? It's called reverse engineering a DCF to a story. And to me, it's one of the most effective ways of combating fairy tales. What's a fairy tale? If you tell me Apple's going to grow 50% a year for the next 10 years, I'm going to say, stop telling me fairy tales. It's not going to happen. So we're going to talk today about testing stories for whether they're viable. In fact, we're going to test them for whether they're possible, plausible, or probable. And I'll explain the contrast in a little while. But that's going to be a big chunk of what we talk about today, is testing stories for reasonableness. So let's say you finish your valuation and it's built on a story. You like your story, right? That's your valuation. Do you think that story might change over the course of the next 2 months, the next 6 months, the next year? In fact, let me throw some things at you and you tell me whether this might change your story. An earnings report from a company, could that change your story? For instance, the company that I just valued in the previous page, 50% compounded growth and a 20% margin. What if for the next 2 reports I find that the revenue growth is now at 2%? Well, maybe I should re-examine my story. Maybe this growth is not going to happen. So earnings reports obviously can change my story. Could macroeconomic changes affect my story? You are valuing a financial service company on November 1st of 2016. And you came up with a story of a very heavily regulated environment where banks are not going to be allowed to do the things they used to be able to do, where capital changes are coming and Dodd-Frank is going to kick in. Could that story be different on November 15th? What happened in the middle? You had an election. And the election basically changed the rules of the game. And that basically means that the same company, same financials, you can have a different story and a different valuation. Regulatory changes? Yeah, of course they can change your story if you're a regulated company. Here's an interesting one. You're valuing Snap. And Facebook comes out with an earnings report saying advertising revenues are slowing dramatically in the online advertising space. It's nothing to do with your company, right? But doesn't it? I mean, when you find that revenues are dropping off at the biggest player in this game, you might have to re-examine your story about Snap. So all of those can change your story, which means your story is constantly going to be evolving. Don't fight it. It's actually what makes valuation exciting. You're never quite done. You have a story, it's like the never-ending story, right? Basically, the chapters keep rolling out, and your story will change with it as well. And there's a final point I want to make. I mean, as you go across companies, they can range from young startups all the way to mature or declining companies. Okay? So I valued Snap 2 weeks ago. Where would you put it in the life cycle? Very young company, like. In fact, if you think about life cycles the same way as in human age, Snap is like, what, a 3-year-old maybe? A very promising 3-year-old. I don't even know what that means. Right? They crawl much faster than everybody else. They're reading at 3. Very promising, but still a 3-year-old. Facebook is more like a precocious teenager. Google is like, peak of your life, 27, 28, you're making a lot of money. Apple's like this very wealthy 45-year-old. Microsoft is this 56-year-old, keeps trying to do facelifts and it doesn't look like it's working. IBM is like a 75-year-old, and Yahoo is dead and still walking, right? Basically, this is the life cycle. So let's think across the life cycle. I told you every valuation is a mix of stories and numbers, right? Early in the life cycle, what do you think matters more? What numbers do I have for Snap? Nothing. There's nothing there. Everything is on story, right? Basically, it's my story about Snap. The analogy I would give is you're in chapter 1 of a book. The entire book is in front of you. You can write the story. As a company ages, you see how the numbers start to get in the way of your story? They get in the way of your story because they constrain your story. So as companies age, you're going to see numbers matter more, stories matter less. So if your skill is spreadsheet building, modeling, not valuation, you're going to be okay valuing the Apples and the Yahoos and the Microsofts of the world because it's all about the numbers. But you're not going to have a chance at valuing Snap because you can't tell a story. That's why I want you to work on your storytelling as well, because if you really want to be able to value any company, which is what I hope you will be able to do by the end of the semester, you need to have that storytelling capacity. So let me spend today's session on that. And I'm going to start off with an admission I gave you at the very first class. I told you when I first started this class, first, what did I describe myself as, a number cruncher or a storyteller? I was a natural number cruncher. And for the first 6 or 7 years I taught this class, I taught it as a number crunching class, which meant it was all about the numbers. And I told you why I started having to tell stories. Does anybody remember why? Because I had no faith in my own valuations. What does that mean, faith? Why do we do valuation? Because after you do a value and you compare to the price, what do we hope to be able to do is act on the valuation. So if you have something cheap, I found I was unwilling to act. I was unwilling to pull the trigger because I knew this was all a collection of numbers, that by moving a number, I could make the number go to whatever number I wanted to. I could value companies mechanically, but I was unwilling to act on those valuations because I had no faith. This was about 7, 8 years into the class I discovered this. This is an existential crisis you're facing, right? Should I even be doing this for the rest of my life? It didn't last very long. Because I said, I can if I can start to tell stories that back my valuations. And I made a confession. The first time I did this, it was like pulling teeth. Because my natural instinct was open the spreadsheet, enter numbers. Don't waste your time on storytelling. And over the last 20 plus years, I've worked on making myself better as a storyteller. I will never be my 17-year-old son. Remember the one I talked about? He's the poet whose poetry doesn't rhyme. Right? I'm not going to be a poet. It's not in my makeup, but I can make myself better as a storyteller. I want my valuations to truly bridge stories and numbers. So I've had to teach myself how to tell stories and how to convert the stories into numbers. And I'm going to take what I've learned about the process and put it into steps. Why? Because I'm a natural number cruncher. We have to think sequentially. Everything is linear. So if you don't like linear thinking, just jumble up the steps. There's no particular sequence you need. So here are the 5 steps that we're going to go through in converting a story to numbers. I'm going to start off and I'm going to survey the landscape. Sounds fancy, right? But I have to understand my company. I have to understand the business. I have to understand the competition before I start telling you a story about the company and converting the story into valuation. So I'm going to start with that. Second step in the process, after I've surveyed the landscape and understood the company, I'm going to tell you a story about the company. And I'm going to try to keep the story focused enough that you understand what this company is about. Third step in the process is I've got to stop and make sure that story that I've told you is not a fairy tale. I'm going to pass it through 3 tests. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? I call this a 3P test. And I want you to already start thinking about those 3 words, possible, plausible, probable, and think about what makes them different. I have a story, I've told you the story, it's plausible and probable, then I'm going to try to convert that story into numbers. And after I've converted the story into numbers in my valuation, the valuation is going to flow out of it. So by step 4, I've converted my story into numbers and I've got a valuation for the company. Do I like my story at that stage? Of course, it's my story. Do I like my valuation? I love it. Step 5 is difficult for everybody. It's difficult for me. But it's a stage of the process where you present your valuation to other people. Let me ask you a question. You've done a valuation of a company, you present it to other people. What do you want them to tell you? That was amazing. That's exactly the way I'd have valued the company too. Don't waste your time with those people. Your job in valuation is to present your valuation to people who think least like you, or most likely to disagree with you, and to listen to what they tell you is wrong with your valuation. You know how difficult that is for human beings? Because that's the only way you can improve your story, not by listening to people who pat you on the back and say, that's amazing, that's the way I think too, but to people who say, I don't think that way, this is stupid, you shouldn't be doing this. So I'm going to take you through that 5-step process, and I'm going to use 2 companies to illustrate this process. The first, actually, I don't know whether to do 2 companies. No, I think I'm going to do only 1 company because the second company. I'm going to take a company and use it to illustrate the process. The company I'm going to use is a company that I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's Uber. And I'm going to take you through my Uber valuation in June of 2014. Everybody here know what Uber does? How many of you have Uber on your phones? Okay. So everybody kind of... I first heard about Uber in June of 2014. I take the subway, I don't take car service, so I hadn't heard of Uber. I first heard about Uber in June of 2014 when I read a news story in the Wall Street Journal. And here's what it said. That Uber had raised money from venture capitalists who had priced the company. Notice the word I used, priced the company at $17 billion. Why didn't I use the word valued the company? Because venture capitalists don't value companies, they price companies. So let's be completely honest about it. They price at $17 billion. And I was surprised. A company I'd never heard of being priced at $17 billion. Let me actually take that back. I'd seen the word Uber on my credit card statements for the 3 months leading into June of 2014. Turned out that my second son, who was going to college in North Carolina, was using Uber and using my credit card to back up his Uber. I don't know how that happened, but I thought he was taking German language classes, to be quite honest. The no umlaut on the U should have kind of given it away. No, but I had no idea what Uber was. So when I see this news story, Uber priced at $17 billion, guess who I called? I called my son. But he was still sleeping. It was only 11:30 in the morning. He kept college student hours, which meant that he went to sleep at 4 in the morning, woke up at who knows what time zone he was on. Right? So he was still sleeping. So I called my niece, who lives in Chicago and who works, who has to actually get up in the morning to go to work. So she picks up the phone and says, what do you want? Very rude. I said, hello, uncle, what do you want? I said, what's this Uber thing? She said, it's a ride-sharing company. I said, what the heck is a ride-sharing company? She said, I don't have the time, and she hangs up the phone. I should talk to her mother about this. So after she hangs up the phone, I said, what? No, that. And before she hung up, she said, why don't you download the app for yourself and find out? At that time, I said, this must be an app. I went to the Apple store, looked up the word Uber, typed it in, app downloads. I hit the app, and a GPS opens up. And a car starts driving towards 44 West 4th Street. And there's a guy called George sitting in the front seat. I said, this is neat. I've never seen this happen with a yellow cab, where I know a cab is coming towards me and I know the name of the person. So the cab pulls up right in front of 44 West 4th Street. And I say, hi, George. He says, what do you want? Another rude person. So, where do you want to go? I said, I really don't want to go anywhere. Could you drive me around for 45 minutes? I have a few questions to ask you. He thought I was a serial killer for a moment. Then he took one look at me and said, I can take this guy, get in the back seat. Right? So I get in and I start asking him questions. I say, is this an Uber car you're driving? He said, no, this is my car. I said, are you an Uber employee? He said, no, I'm an independent contractor. I said, why are you doing this? He said, I have a regular job. I don't make enough money on it. This allows me to earn a second income with a car I already own. I said, does Uber pay your insurance because there's a lot of driving? He said, no, I don't tell my insurance company. I drive for Uber. So finally he pulls back up in front of 44 West 4th Street, 45 minutes after my questioning. He drops me off. I offer to pay him. He says, you don't have to pay me. I said, it's free? He said, no. When you entered the app, did they ask you for a credit card? I said, yes. Oh, okay. They charge you a credit card. So how do you get paid then? He said, Uber sends me 80% or whatever the charge is. I remember asking, why 80%? He said, I don't know, that's what they all do. So at this stage, I knew why this guy drove for Uber. Basically, he needed Uber because it was a matchmaking service. In New York City, it's illegal to stop on the street and ask you, do you want to ride somewhere? So Uber allowed him to connect with customers. And this allowed him to earn a second income on something he already owned without any explicit costs in terms of insurance and maintenance, etc. So I kind of understood why he drove for Uber. I understood why Uber did what they did. Why? Because for being a matchmaker, what do they get? They get 20% of every fare. They don't own the cars. They don't hire the drivers. This is a great business. The only remaining question I didn't have an answer to is, why do customers like Uber? So I decided to call my son back again. This time at like 3:30 in the afternoon, where he has no excuse for still sleeping. And he actually owns a car that he had in North Carolina. So I decided to put him on the defensive right away. This is a tactic I've discovered works very, very well with my kids. Is put them on the defensive right away, then they'll be forced to answer questions. So I start off aggressively. I said, Brendan, I see you've been using Uber. I acted like I knew what Uber was all the time. And using my credit card on your Uber. Why are you even taking Uber if you have a car already in North Carolina? And he said, Dad, on Friday nights and Saturday nights, I really like Uber. Now, there are some questions you don't want to have as follow-up questions on as a parent. I kind of got it. But this is a kid, I can't even visualize him calling a yellow cab, right, going on the street, hailing the car. So I said, what do you like about Uber? He said, I can call the car from the bar. I said, okay, that's a big plus. But I said, these cars must cost a lot more than a cab, right? He said, no, they're cheaper than a cab. I said, really? You must wait forever for an Uber, right? He said, no, they come quicker than a cab. So they're cheaper, they're quicker. I said, these cars must be filthy, right? He said, no, much cleaner than a cab. I said, let me get this straight. They're faster than a cab, they're cheaper than a cab, they're cleaner than a cab. That's when I knew cab service was destined for doom. Let's face it, cab service as we know it is primitive, right? How do you hail a cab in New York City? The same way you probably hailed a horse carriage in the 1880s, right? Horse carriage, come on over. The horse guy just gallops over. That's pretty much how we still do it. It is absurd that in 2017, to call a yellow cab, you got to go on the street. It's raining, it's snowing, it's icy, it's minus 10 degrees, and you're going to wave your hand, and the cab driver might stop for you, might not. You watch him play games. Not for hire, not for hire, not hire. No, you're going the wrong direction, I'm not coming. What kind of technology is this? So at this stage, I had a sense at least of why customers liked Uber, drivers liked Uber, why Uber existed. The one final question I had to answer for myself is, why can't I do it from my basement? Well, it is a matchmaking service. Why can't I be a ride-sharing company? And there were three answers I came up with that set Uber apart from me. One was $3 billion. What's the $3 billion? That's how much I raised from the venture capitalists. You know how much money I raised from a venture capitalist for my ride-sharing service? Zero. 3 billion versus zero. So already they start off at an advantage. The second is there's a networking benefit in this business. Do you know what I mean by that? As you start to sign up drivers and you get bigger and bigger, it gets easier for you to continue to get bigger, whereas a new player has to enter in and they have no drivers signed up. They're competing against somebody who's more established. So it actually gets easier for you to get bigger as you get further. There's a networking benefit. And the third is Uber does have some interesting things they do with your data. This New Year's Eve, you're probably not old enough to drink, right? So if you are, this New Year's Eve around, go hang out in Times Square with all those crazy people. I don't know why they even hang out there. At 12:45, you manage to make yourself out of Times Square. Call an Uber and go home 3 miles away. Don't check your credit card that night. Next morning, make sure you're all settled in, sit down in a comfortable spot, open up your credit card statements for the most recent charge. And what are you going to see for that 3-mile Uber ride from New Year's Eve? Probably a $150 charge. You know why, right? What does Uber do with all the data they collect? They use surge pricing, which is actually a more rational way of rationing service than what, with the yellow cab, how do they ration service? You just wait for 5 hours. Maybe you'll get a cab back at 6 o'clock in the morning. But Uber just raises the price to the demand and supply equation. So at this stage, I kind of got what Uber did. So I'm ready to tell a story about Uber. So what does this mean? The story you tell, so actually once I did my research, and you can't even really call it research, right? You're saying, why don't you pour over the financials of Uber? Why didn't I? It's a private company. The only numbers I got were leaked numbers that came out of somebody stealing numbers out of a slide that got presented to a venture capitalist. So there were no numbers. My research was really understanding what the company did, what business it was in, what the customers liked about it, what the employees liked about it. So I had a sense of what the company did. Now I have to convert what I know about Uber into a story. So let me explain what I mean by this. When you think about storytelling for valuation, remember you're not writing a creative novel. I still remember about 10 years ago, my oldest son came to me with a book suggestion. He said, you should read this book, Dad. It's a great book. And he hands me this book. It's like 1,200 pages thick. It's a book written by a guy called George R. Martin. It's called Game of Thrones. I started reading it. And your kids give you book suggestions. You should take it seriously. I started reading it. Halfway through the book, I called him and said, Ryan, I can't do this anymore. There are like hundreds of characters in this book. They wander on, they wander off, they die, they come back to life. There are all these empires. I've lost track of this entire book. I'm too old for this. I know you like the book, but keep reading it. I'm not doing it. So here's my first suggestion. If you're telling a business story, don't make it Game of Thrones. You don't want 7 seasons and 21 episodes to tell me, hey, this is what my business is about. So keep it simple. Keep it focused. On what? What's the end game for every business? To have more apps, more downloads, more users, it is? To make money. You got to tell me how you plan to make money on this business. Show me the pathway to profitability. It doesn't have to be tomorrow. It doesn't have to be a week from now. It doesn't have to be even 3 years from now. But tell me how you plan to convert your story into profits. And keep it grounded in reality. Tell me a story that I can buy into as a business story. Here's a good test. If you have a startup and you want to sell that startup, wait for Thanksgiving this year, and your elderly aunt, you know what I'm talking about, sits next to you. And she says, what's this business you're starting? I want you to be able to explain to your elderly, this 80-year-old aunt, what your business is. That's the kind of story you want. Something that anybody can grapple with, not just people who know finance or know models or know spreadsheets. So tell a story. So I'm going to tell you my story for Uber. And every part of the story is going to matter because you're going to see it play out in my valuation. So in June of 2014, here's what my Uber story looked like. I called Uber an urban car service company. Let me take those words apart. When I say urban, where do I see Uber succeeding? Towns and cities. Car service, I view the primary business as car service, urban car service business, that will bring in new users into the business, like whom? Like my son, somebody who'd never have taken a cab, who's now going to take the car service. That has local networking benefits. Remember I said it's, once you get larger, it gets easier and easier to keep growing because you have more drivers who have signed up with you. So if Uber becomes the largest car service company in New York, there's going to be a tipping point at which they become dominant. You're saying, what's the local? Let's say Uber becomes the largest car service company in New York, and I decide to fly to Chicago. I land in O'Hare. Do I care about who the largest car service company is in New York, or do I care about who the largest car service company is in Chicago when I look for a ride-sharing company in Chicago? I'm going to look in Chicago. So in my story, Uber can end up dominating New York, Lyft can end up dominating Chicago, and Didi Chuxing can end up dominating Beijing. You can have each company end up dominating its own space. It's my story. You don't like it? Tell your own story. That's the way I think about valuation. I have to tell my story, and this is my story in June of 2014. I'm going to assume it can maintain this 80-20 mix. That's completely arbitrary. Grab Taxi, which is Southeast Asia, Malaysia, is 85-15. Ola is 80-20, which is the Indian car service. Didi Chuxing, I don't think ever charges anybody. God only knows how they make money. But basically, I have no idea what their revenue sharing is. But there's no good reason for the 80-20. I'm assuming that they can maintain it. Why? Because they set the rules for the game. And finally, I'm going to assume that they can keep their existing capital-intensive model going, which means what? That they don't own the cars and they don't hire the drivers. Remember the story, because my job is to take this story and convert into numbers. Any question at this stage? So I've now told a story about the company. Now comes that three-part test. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? I'll give you a very simple way of answering this question. Any Knicks fans in this room? Nobody even wants to admit to being a Knicks fan anymore, right? So let me ask you a question. Even if you're not a Knicks fan, you should be able to answer it. Is it possible that the Knicks could win the NBA championship this year? It's possible, right? Anything is possible. What could happen? The entire Cleveland team could walk off and not refuse to play. And the Knicks basically walk through the East, and then they go to the West, and the Warriors all decide that they're going to just give in to the Knicks because New York finally needs a championship. It's possible, right? But is it plausible? Come on, with this Knicks team, of course it's not plausible. Is it probable? The numbers would probably be 0.000003%. It's possible, but it's not plausible or probable. Is it possible that Cleveland could win the NBA championship this year? Sure, right? Is it plausible that they could win a championship if now some pieces have to come into play? Maybe they will need Kevin Long to come back for the playoffs, or maybe they will need J.R. Smith to not blow up, or whatever, his ankle's broken, his ankle magically heals. But you can see that it's plausible, and maybe even you could attach a probability. You might say it's low now that they're injured. Is it possible that the Warriors could win the NBA championship? Yes. Is it plausible? Yes. Is it probable? Yes, but lower than it was 2 weeks ago. Why? Because Kevin Durant just got hurt. Do you see what I mean by possible, plausible, probable? Every season I start off, I'm a Yankee fan, and I said, thank you, the season hasn't started yet. Because at the start of season, I can say, is it possible the Yankees could win the World Series this year? Yes. 40 games from the season, they're 10-30. If you ask me, is it possible? I say, oh, yes, but no, the rest, plausible, probable, drop off. Possible, plausible, probable, and you have to pass your story through all three. I don't want to see impossible stories in your valuation. What are examples of impossible stories? You tell me your company will grow at 5% a year forever. Remember the Tesla example I gave you, 6% growth forever? That's an impossible story. Tesla cannot grow 6% a year forever. It's not a question of difference of opinion, it's just mathematically impossible. Netflix cannot have $600 billion in revenues in year 10. Impossible story. There aren't enough people on the face of the earth for that to happen. You cannot grow forever by cutting costs. Why not? So you grow for the next 3 years, you cut costs, your margins go up, right? You keep cutting costs, your margins keep going up until the margins hit 100%. And then what? You have no costs, nothing to cut. You can grow for the next 5 years, the next 10 years by cutting costs, but you can't grow forever. Oh, here's a very, very simple technical impossibility. If you're building your own spreadsheet, you're going to take after-tax earnings, you're going to add depreciation, you're going to subtract out CapEx, two separate line items, right? Is it possible for depreciation to exceed CapEx next year? It's not a trick question. Of course it is. Why? Because depreciation reflects past capital expenditures, and next year you might choose not to invest. Is it possible that depreciation could exceed CapEx for the next 5 years? Yeah, if you're living off the fat. Is it possible that your depreciation could exceed CapEx forever? Why is it not possible? Because what do you get to depreciate? It's what you CapEx. That's an impossible valuation. I'll make a statement, and I think I can back this up. 1 out of 4 valuations done in practice, and these have some of the biggest names on them, Goldman Sachs, KKR, are impossible valuations. There's nothing to debate. This cannot happen. That's an impossible valuation. Let's move one step up the ladder. Let's talk about implausible valuations. You have a company where you put in growth and there's no reinvestment. You're magically able to grow without reinvesting. I'm pushing back. I'm saying, how are you going to pull this? If you can give me a really good reason, I'll walk away. I'll give you an example. MBA student of mine from several years ago works for the NFL. Great job, they don't pay well. And he actually had a valuation of an NFL team that he sent me and said, can you take a look at this team valuation? So he'd put in a growth rate and the earnings and the cash flows. And this team owns its own stadium, and I noticed he wasn't putting any money back into the stadium, the earnings. So I called him and I said, I notice you're not reinvesting anything to keep the stadium going. How come? He said, that's easy. Every time we need to refurbish our stadium, here's what we do. We go to the city and we threaten them. With what? We're moving to Las Vegas. We're moving to LA. We're moving to San Diego. And guess what they do? The local government says, no, you can't leave, and they refurbish. I said, this is a great jig you're running, if you can, so I can see what you're doing. In this case, I'm okay with it because you gave me a really good reason. I'll give you a second example. This January, I was in Dubai valuing a Saudi company called Al Marai. It's a Saudi food processing company. Incredibly high profit margins. If you compare it to all the other Middle Eastern food companies, its margins are about twice as high. So I remember finishing the valuation and throwing this question. This was entirely almost a Middle Eastern analyst audience. And I said, what's going on here? How come the margins are so high? They have no competition. And one of the analysts said, have you looked at the list of who owns shares in the company? I said, I haven't, but I should. I pulled up the list. And second on the list was somebody bin Saud. No, the bin Saud tells you, right? They're part of the Saudi royal family. There's your competitive advantage. He's standing at the border saying, you can't come in. This is my company, they have my market. There's your competitive advantage. Again, with implausible valuations, if you can give me a good reason, I'm going to let you go. So impossible, there's no slack. Implausible, I'm looking for a really good reason. Improbable valuations are the final stage. When I think about valuations, I think of what I call a valuation triangle. Sounds fancy, but here are the three sides to my triangle. One side is growth, the second side is reinvestment, the third side is risk. You ready? I'm going to throw you one side of the triangle, and you tell me what you'd expect to see on the other two. If I see high growth in your valuation, generally what should I expect to see as reinvestment? High or low? High, and usually high risk. High makes sense. Low makes sense. But I see high growth and low reinvestment and low risk. That's an improbable valuation. Improbable in what sense? I'm going to push back and say, what's special about the company? Because you're describing a very special company, a company that's able to grow with relatively little reinvestment and relatively little risk. But if you can tell me why this is a special company, why this is the next Facebook or the next Google, I'm going to say, okay, I get it. That's what you're going to get as feedback on your DCFs, is I'm going to look at your own growth rate, your reinvestment and your risk, and I'm going to draw the valuation. You can do this yourself. You don't even need my feedback. Take your own growth, reinvestment, and risk. Of course, the prerequisite is you've actually done a valuation. So after you've done the valuation, put it through the triangle, see if it's an improbable valuation. That's the test you need to pass. And with my Uber story in June of 2014, I passed it through the test. What did I describe Uber as doing? Being an urban car service company, right? That story is probable. Why? Because they're already succeeding as an urban car service company. So that clearly is not something I made up. I assumed that it would pull in new customers into the business. I could give you anecdotal evidence, but I'd be acting like my mother-in-law if I did that. So instead, I'm going to give you something much more general. Do you know the part of the country where ride-sharing companies have their deepest roots? Where did they get started? Uber, Lyft, they all got started in the same part of the country. It's the Bay Area, right? Do you know that the car service business in the Bay Area is 3 times larger than it was before the ride-sharing companies came along? Because pre-2009, if you looked at the car service company in the Bay Area, taxi cabs and car service companies, you look at the size of... So what's Uber and Lyft and the other, they're attracting people into car service who otherwise would have been on mass transit or taken a bus or driven their own cars. So I think I'm on pretty reasonable ground, assuming that new customers would come in. But in June of 2014, there was a final piece of the story that I was not willing to accept. But I did change my mind later. And here's what that story was. To understand the story, I'm going to give you a chronology of my typical day. I wake up around 5:30, I go to the gym, I get back, I get in my car. I live only 4 minutes away from the train station, but I'm really lazy. So I drive to the train station, I park my car at the train station. and I come into work. I work all day, but I leave pretty early. I keep academic hours, which means I leave whenever I feel like leaving, and I get back home at about 5:30. I get into my car, drive 4 minutes back into home, I park the car, and the car sits there till the next morning, and I repeat this. So on a typical weekday, I drive my car 8 minutes. On weekends, I go crazy. I sometimes drive 25 minutes on a weekend, maybe 35 minutes. Collectively, I drive probably an hour and a half a week, and for this, I own a car, I pay insurance. It's absurd, right? But until 5 years ago, you know what my defense would have been? What choice do I have? I'm in the suburbs. I can't exactly call a yellow cab. Do you see the Uber threat that's coming to transportation? A few weeks ago, I was on the train and I look out of the window, and there's a big billboard ad from Uber. And here's what it says. Did you drive to the station today? Try Uber. You see where the next phase of this story could go? You could actually argue that Uber could become a replacement for a second car in the suburbs, and that actually expands your market substantially. It could make Uber a much more valuable company. But in June of 2014, I wasn't quite ready to go there, so I stopped with it being a car service company, an urban car service company. I'm going to take a tangent here and show you stories that don't quite work. I don't know what you plan to do after you graduate. But let's say whatever you do, you start doing it, and 6 months into whatever you're doing, you find you're incredibly bored. So you quit. And you become a movie producer. Don't ask me how that happens. And you move to LA, you hang out at the Beverly Hills Hilton by the pool, and people come and pitch stories to you. So you ready? You're now a movie producer, you're sitting at the Beverly Hills Hilton pool, and I'm going to come and pitch a story to you. And you tell me whether this story sounds like a story you want to make into a movie. This is a story about a 19-year-old who drops out of Stanford. Who does that? What's their acceptance rate? -3%? Okay. Getting into Stanford is tough enough. This person got into Stanford and drops out at 19 and starts a business. You're saying another tech geek dropping out. Bill Gates dropped out. But this is not a he, this is a she. This is a 19-year-old woman who drops out of Stanford to start a business, and not a tech business, but a business that actually we're all intimately familiar with that we absolutely hate. It's called the blood testing business. Remember your previous experience of the blood testing? I'll give you how my experience of the blood testing business goes. You have to get a blood test, you call the lab to set up an appointment. They say 6 a.m. 4 weeks from now. So something more civilized. Well, we have an open appointment at 9, 2.5 years from now. So, okay, I'll take the 6 a.m. So 6 a.m. 4 weeks from now, you show up at the lab and they make you wait 2 hours. Why? Because they can. 8 o'clock, the door opens and a nurse comes out, and she looks like Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. If you've never seen Nurse Ratched, you got to see her because it's kind of a scary experience. She says, "Come on in," and you go in, and there are 2 buckets next to her. So what are those buckets for? Your blood. You need buckets of blood just in case Dracula shows up. So 15 minutes later, she extracts half your blood, anemic, you drag yourself out of the room. You get into your car, you drive home. You don't hear from the lab for like 2 weeks. You call the lab and say, "I came in for a blood test 2 weeks ago. I don't seem to have the results." The receptionist says, "We can't give you the results." So why? Privacy laws. What? That's my blood. We'll tell your doctor, and he will tell you or she will tell you what's wrong with your blood. So now the whole experience gets restarted. You call the doctor and he says, 6 a.m. 4 weeks from now. So you've done this dance before. 4 weeks later, you show up at 6 a.m. They make you wait till 8. You go and the doctor's sitting behind a desk reading your blood tests. He says, "Do you want to know what your blood test said?" "Yes, yes. Maybe I will tell you, maybe I won't." And after toying with you for about 15 minutes, there's nothing wrong with you. Don't get too relaxed, because 6 weeks later, you get the final indignity in the mail. And it's a bill for $1,500. For what? Extracting 2 buckets of your blood and finding nothing wrong with you. Now let's face it, you hate this business, right? So here's what this 19-year-old who drops out of Stanford is going to do. She's going to take 2 drops of your blood, not 2 buckets, in a nanotainer, that means a tiny, tiny container, and in 35 minutes give you results on 36 different tests of blood emailed to you. And it'll cost you only $50. Now tell me, do you want the story to be true? This is what I call a runaway story, a story that's so good you want it to be true. And I wish I were making up these things, but I'm not. The 19-year-old dropped out of Stanford was called Elizabeth Holmes. And the company she started was a company called TerraKnows that did exactly what I described. 2 drops of blood, there's a nanotrainer right there. 36 different tests, 30 minutes later, emailed to you, cost you only $50. Obviously, you're not the only ones who want the story to be true. She told this to venture capitalists, they wanted it to be true. They pushed up the value of the company to more than $9 billion by the middle of 2015. The Cleveland Clinic, one of the top healthcare entities in the country, decided they wanted to partner with TerraKnows because they said they found so much promise. Walgreens was talking about setting up TerraKnows labs on every Walgreens around the country. So everybody was buying into the story. And in the middle of 2015, he'd asked me, is there any substance to this story? I said, I don't know much about the company, but all these people lined up, there must be, otherwise why would they be doing this? So let me ask you a question. If you are investing in a blood testing company, what is the first question you're going to ask the company? This isn't a social media company, it's not an advertising, it's a blood testing company. The question you're going to ask is, does it work, right? And I assume somebody would have asked this question, but obviously I was wrong because in October of 2015, a Wall Street Journal reporter decides to ask this question, do these 36 tests actually work? And in fact, when you're a blood testing company, you have to do tests and they're in the public domain. So he went in and he checked and he found that it had been approved for only 1 of the 36 tests. So I asked, what's wrong? Why didn't you give them the approval for the other 35? And the regulatory agency says because the tests were noisy. You say, what's a noisy test? Let's suppose you get tested for leukemia. With a noisy test, here's what you get as a result. You might have leukemia, or you might not. Don't worry too much about it. If things get worse, we'll let you know. This is not exactly a feature you look for in a test, right? Oh, it's a noisy test. I love noisy tests. Test didn't work. Now, the real question was, all these smart people, some of the biggest venture capitalists in Silicon Valley invested in this company, none of them asked this question. And there was a board of directors for the company that supposedly was also overseeing the company. They didn't ask the question. So I went and looked up the board of directors for TerraKnows. It's right there. And my first reaction as I read through the names was, he's still alive? Him too? You have George Shultz. He was Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan in 1981. The guy is a sprightly 94. I'm sure he's a very, very upbeat, healthy 94-year-old. But if Henry Kissinger, what does he do? He said, where's the Iron Curtain? Lead me towards it. 92 years old. I might be cynical, but as I look at this list, I'm not sure whether this is a CIA front company or just a collection of old people that you put together because I mean, let's face it, if you're a megalomaniac CEO and you want to create a board of directors that will never ask you questions, here's a good strategy. Pick a bunch of 80 to 90-year-olds. Call a board meeting. Put up pillows in front of each chair, right? Have an ambulance as backup. You never know with 80 to 90-year-olds. 90 minutes later, the meeting's over. Everybody's woken up and say, go on home. Nothing happened in the meeting. They say, okay. No. I don't want to be ageist, but this is not exactly a board you would expect in a company that wants questions asked. You know the other dead giveaway that there was something fishy going on? What's Elizabeth wearing? A black turtleneck. She actually boasted about the fact that she owned 300 black turtlenecks. If you don't believe me, there's a vanity. She said, this is the peak of glory. She said, the only thing I own is a black turtleneck. Why 300? People don't even notice you're wearing the other black turtleneck, the 227. They all look the same. You know why that makes me suspicious? Who used to wear black all the time? Steve Jobs, right? In fact, she had a big picture of Steve Jobs. if you're selling a story, at least make it your story. This is the exact opposite of authentic for you to dress up like somebody else. And starting in October of 2015, everything unraveled. One after the other, the pieces fell apart. You know what's happened to TerraKnows? It's shut down. Elizabeth Holmes has been banned from being in the blood testing business for the next 5 years. But $9 billion is gone, right? All those people invested in it. But this can happen so easily. When you have a story that sounds really good, nobody wants to ask the tough questions. Why? Because you want it to be true. So sometimes in a company, you say, what's going on here? Because the story sounds so good, nobody wants to test the story. Let's take another example of implausible happening. So let's assume you're looking at a big market. I'll give them by big market a name. It could be cloud computing. It could be online advertising. It could be China, right? And let's say you're an entrepreneur. Any of you know, anybody in this class starting their own business entrepreneurial? No? Do you know any entrepreneurs? Come on, you must know somebody who's an entrepreneur. So let me ask you a question about entrepreneurs in general. Do they tend to be overconfident people or diffident people? By definition, if you're an entrepreneur, you think you can conquer the world, so by definition, so hang in there with me. So you're an entrepreneur, an overconfident entrepreneur looking at a big market, right? You go to venture capitalists, raise capital. Venture capitalists, they tend to be overconfident people or diffident people. They're incredibly overconfident. So what you have is an overconfident entrepreneur who's attracted 3 overconfident venture capitalists looking at a big market. So what does it mean when I say you're overconfident? What's happening? You're overestimating your chance of success. You're overestimating the revenues and profits you will make, and you value your business with those overestimates. Remember, you're not the only one who saw this big market. There are 100 other clusters just like yours, with an overconfident entrepreneur, 3 overconfident venture capitalists, all looking at that big market. Do you see what's going to happen in this market? Each cluster is going to think it's going to be the winner. Each cluster is going to value itself on that assumption. But if you add up all 100 clusters, what are you going to find? That collectively, they've overvalued themselves. This is what I call the macro delusion. It happens every time there's a big market. It's not a bug, it's a feature of this process. So I'll make it explicit. Let's take the online advertising business. We all know it's a big business, it's growing, everybody wants to be in the business. Snap wants to be in the business, Facebook wants to be in the business. So here's what I did about 2 years ago. I took every publicly traded company which gets money from online advertising. So I took Google and Facebook and Yandex and Yelp and went down the list. I took the market cap of every one of these companies and I backed out from the market cap. So I did some reverse engineering. I said, if the market cap is right, how much revenue would I need in year 10 to justify the market cap? So I did that with each company. In the last column, you see the imputed revenue based on the market cap. I added up the imputed revenue of all of these companies in the marketplace in 2015. And the collective revenue that the market seemed to be imputing into the market capitalization was about $522 billion. You're saying, so what? The entire online advertising market in 2015 was $220 billion. Advertising overall was about $600 billion. Basically, and this doesn't even count all the companies waiting in the wings, ready to come on, right? It doesn't include Snap. I can almost guarantee you that there's no way that 10 years from now you're going to have $525 billion collective revenues in this market. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying every one of these companies is overvalued. What am I saying? Collectively, they're overvalued. You might have 3 or 4 out of this that are going to explode out of the box. They might be the next Google or Facebook. But the rest, you're going to see their prices adjust because people are going to wake up one day and say, the market's not big enough for all of us. Now do you see why I was more cautious about the Snap valuation the market seems to be? I see the market. I know it's a big market, but I know there are dozens and dozens of companies trying for that big market, and 2 big giants, Facebook and Google, that are sucking the oxygen out of this market. I don't see how Snap can be worth $30 billion, which is what it was priced at a week ago. And Facebook, in other words, all of these pricings can't be all right. Something's got to give. For every winner, there's got to be a loser here. So unless you tell me who Snap is pulling revenues from, and you can no longer use the New York Times, it's gone. There's not enough revenue here. It has to be getting revenues from Facebook or from Google. I don't see how you can get to a $30 billion or $35 billion value. So the macro delusion basically means that any time you have a big market, what's going to happen? You're going to get an overvaluation, which is going to correct. And people are going to wag their fingers and say, that's a bubble, you shouldn't do this. And I have no patience for them. This is not a bug, it's a feature. Why does it happen? Because we're overconfident as human beings. We think we can do things that are really out of our reach. I ask people, would you rather live in a world run by actuaries? You know any actuaries? Everything's based on probabilities. If we lived in a world run by actuaries, we'd still be in caves. Right? They're working out the odds. No way, you're never going to get out of here. Right? Every advance in humankind has come from people overreaching. So I have no problems with there being a bubble in the tech space. I don't think of it as a bad thing. I think this is how change happens. Remember that dot-com bubble that burst? All the terrible things you read about it? Did it change the way we live? Last week I went to Nigeria. 30 years ago, if I had to go to Nigeria, you know what I'd have to do? I'd have to go to a travel agent. Most of you don't even know what a travel agent looks like. There used to be one right on 5th Avenue and 8th Street, a big office. You walked in, there were 12 people with terminals in front of them. And you'd go up and say, I have to go to Nigeria. And the person would very secretively look up on the terminal. These are the 3 flights you can take. It'll cost you $3,000, and our commission is $300. And you paid because you had no choice. It's changed the way we live. I made all of my reservations online. I checked in online. I made my hotel reservations online. I essentially lived online. So when we complain about these changes and how there are bubbles, remember social media might be a bubble, but it's changed the way we get our news. It's changed the way we interact. So this is a feature, not a bug, and it comes from that underlying optimism that drives what people do. One final point, and this is on the possibility plausible. This is actually a valuation of Tesla that I pulled out of an equity research report for Tesla. Now, Tesla is a company I valued on my blog off and on for the last 4 or 5 years. So I've been an optimist on Tesla as a company. I have my qualms about Elon Musk overreaching, but I think the company has features that no other automobile company does. In fact, think about it. What other automobile company can announce a new model that's not going to come out for 2 or 3 years and have 400,000 people put down $1,500 as it? Would you do that for a Chevy? Even after it's come out, 2 years afterwards, I don't know whether I can pay $1,500 for that car. It doesn't. Here people. So clearly, you can't dismiss the company. So I value the company, and I basically have my story. I value the company, and usually I've come up with values lower than the price, not by much. And this was right after I'd valued the company about 150. So this equity research report comes out where he's put a target price of 500 on Tesla. So what's he doing? Why is he? So I pick up the equity research report and I almost fall over. It's like 250 pages thick. So I start to browse through it. And on page 55, there's a DCF. This is what he called it, a D.C.F of Tesla. So I said, okay, this is my ball of wax. Let me see what this DCF looks like. So I look at the top line, and he's projecting a pretty optimistic future. The number of cars that Tesla is going to sell is going to go from 24,000 in the most recent 12 months to 1.1 million over the 10 years. I said, okay, you're optimistic. And remember, the Tesla 3 alone has got 400,000 people signed up, so 1.1 million in 10 years, not infeasible. So it's an optimistic story, but I could live with it. And his revenue growth was not that different from mine. So I said, that's strange. His revenue seemed to be pretty close to mine. Then I looked at his margins. Maybe his margins are much higher. His margins in fact, were a little lower than mine. Now I'm really puzzled. He has the same revenues I do, lower margins. How come his value is 4 times higher? I keep working down, and after you get after-tax operating income, remember you subtract out capex and working capital. I look at what he reinvests, and it looks like he's not reinvesting much money for the next 10 years. He has capex, but it's barely above depreciation. Now remember, this is not a social media company, right? It's an automobile company, which means to go from 24,000 cars to 1.1 million cars, what do you need? You need assembly lines. I know they have the Fremont plant, but the Fremont plant's capacity is about 150 to 200,000 cars. So I called the equity research analyst. He's actually in an airport on a mission to Tesla. This must be like a He goes and prays, oh, great Tesla in the sky, and then he comes back. So he picks up the phone, and I tell him who I am, and then that I've been looking at his DCF. And I said, I have some questions about your DCF. He said, I cannot answer that question. I said, why? He said, because this is a team that worked on the DCF, and the team has to be together before we answer the questions. I said, okay. When will your team be together? He said, there are 5 of us. I said, 5 of you were involved in this DCF? He said, yes, 5 of us. And we'll be together next week, and you can call us next week. And I said, okay. And he said, you're not going to write about this on your blog or anything over the next week, are you? I said, no, I'll cut you some slack for the moment, then I'll chop your head off. And so a week later, I call him, and the entire team is gathered together. So I start asking questions, and the lead analyst says, I'm not the one who crunches the numbers. He turns to his second analyst. The lead analyst is a schmoozer. He talks to people, he meets people, but he doesn't run the numbers. So he turns to his second in command, who says, I'm a semi-schmoozer too, so he passes down. And as they pass down the ranks, finally the guy who did the DCF happens to be this 23-year-old that they hired out of business school last year. And he's done all of the number crunching. I feel incredibly sorry for this kid. Right? So I lead him through the process, and I say, you know what, you've got all these cars you're producing, you don't have enough assembly lines, you need CapEx. He said, it slipped my mind. I said, what slipped your mind? The fact that we need all this CapEx. I was just projecting things and I missed it. I made it a percentage of revenues, and he said, what should we do? We can't let out a public release that we've missed it because it'll destroy credibility. I said, that was destroyed already, but I have a suggestion. I said, have you ever watched Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory? He said, no. But one of the old hands says, yeah, I've seen it with Gene Wilder, right? Yeah, I said, I'll tell you, I was a very strange young person. I'm now a strange old person, but when I was younger, I remember watching that movie and coming out of it saying, you know what my biggest question was? Have you ever seen that movie? There's these Willy Wonka chocolates that are sold all over the world, and there's one factory. A 6th-floor factory, which is incredibly inefficiently laid out, like chocolate rivers running through it and stuff. And I remember coming out saying, how the hell does one factory produce all these chocolates to service the world? And the answer actually is in the movie, right? The Oompa Loompas. If you get a chance, go into YouTube and type in Oompa Loompa. These little munchkins that dance around, and while they dance, chocolates come flying out. I said, here's what you need to do. Issue a press release that Tesla has fired all of its regular workers in its Fremont plant and replace them with Oompa Loompas. I call these Oompa Loompa valuations. These are valuations where revenues grow, production increases, but you're not setting aside any money for that production to be created. Please don't turn in any Oompa Loompa valuations to me. In fact, if I get your DCF and I send you back 2 words, Oompa Loompa, I will expect you to get the message that I want you to think about reinvestment, that you've got lots of growth, great ambitions, but somebody's got to build these factories. So when you think about impossible, implausible, improbable, think about that. So we're almost there. I have a story. I'm now going to convert the story into numbers. So let me go back to my story. What did I describe Uber as? An urban car service company, right? So my total market that I used to value Uber was the global urban car service market, the taxi cab market, the car service market, the limo market. And in 2014, that market globally was about $100 billion. So that's my total market. I assumed that Uber would attract new users into the business. The way I reflected that was by assuming that that market would grow. The global car service market would grow at 6% a year, whereas it historically had been growing at 1 to 2% a year. So basically I increased the growth rate. I assumed that Uber would have local networking benefits. Local networking benefits basically means that different cities will be dominated by different ride-sharing companies. I gave Uber a market share of only 10%. That's actually a pretty big market share, but I didn't give them a market share of 40%. Because they're able to keep this 80-20 mix, which is a very lucrative mix for doing nothing, I gave them a target operating margin of 40%. Their business model, they don't own the cars, they don't hire the drivers. The way this is going to manifest itself is for every dollar they invest, they get a huge amount of revenues in return. They're going to get for every dollar invested, $5 in revenues, which is about 2.5 times higher than the typical US company. Is Uber a risky company? Sure, right? Now, how do we usually compute cost of capital? We look up a weight and a risk-free rate and a risk premium and a cost of debt. We take weights. I didn't even waste my time on that. Why? Because I have no idea what the numbers look like. I gave them a cost of capital of 12%. You're saying, how do you come up with the 12%? I actually have a distribution of cost of capital for US companies. A 12% cost of capital puts them at the 95th percentile. I said, look, I can waste my time finessing this discount rate, but this isn't my big assumption. I gave them a cost of capital of 12%. And is there a chance Uber might not make it? It's still a money-losing company. It's still a private company. It does have $3 billion in cash, but it could very quickly burn through it. I assume that there's a 10% chance it will not make it. Every part of my story has now become a number in my valuation. My story about what kind of company it is gave me the total market. My story about local networking benefits gave me the market share. My story about the 80-20 mix became a margin. And my story about risk is now a discount rate and a likelihood I will not make it. I put them into a spreadsheet, and when you actually look at the spreadsheet, it looks like a discounted cash flow valuation that came from a spreadsheet, but every single number in the spreadsheet has a story behind it. What do I mean by that? If you point to revenues in year 10 and say, why do you think Uber will have $3.6 billion in revenues? My answer is not going to be, I used a 50% revenue growth for the next 5 years, and it's going to be because I think Uber is an urban car service company with a local networking benefit. So why are my margins 40%? I'm not going to say because they get to be 40%, but because I assume this 80-20 mix that allows them to make a substantial amount of profit with every number in this valuation has a story behind it. And when I was all done and I fed it in my final valuation, the value that I got for Uber as a company was about $6 billion. Do you remember the story that triggered my interest in Uber? What did it say? That VCs had priced the company at $17 billion. I finished this valuation, and 25 minutes later, I get a call from a Wall Street Journal reporter. She must have been just waiting for the post to come. She said, I just read your post. I said, good. Somebody's reading it. And she said, I noticed you value the company at $6 billion. Then she asked me, how do you explain the $17 billion that venture capitalists are putting on? I said, I don't have to explain it. I didn't pay it. I've never felt the urge to explain what other people pay. It's not my business. I said, you should be calling them and asking them to explain it. Why should I have to explain it? I have never felt the urge. In fact, last week after Snap went public, I get a wave of emails, right? You know why? Because I valued $11 per share. It went to, said, how do you explain it? I don't have to. I didn't pay $28 per share. Go ask somebody who paid the 28 why they paid the 28. Don't ask me to explain what other people do. This is my story, and based on my story, I would not invest at $17 billion. It's not my job to tell you you shouldn't invest, because it will depend on your story for Uber. So now comes the last piece. I've finished my valuation. It gets picked up in 4 very different places. So usually my blog posts have a 48-hour life, and then they die, so people forget it was even posted. It got picked up in a site called 538. You know what 538 is? It's a site maintained by Nate Silver. It's a statistical site. He used to work for the New York Times. Basically, it applies statistical techniques to sport. It's a great site if you ever visit it. They liked the fact that I use numbers and said, can we post? And I said, sure. It got picked up on the Forbes blog, which is read primarily by value investors, old-time investors. It got picked up in a site called TechCrunch. You know what TechCrunch is? Basically, right for tech. No, it's a big Silicon Valley publication. And it got picked up by a blog called The Ride-Sharing Guy. This is actually a guy who writes for just Uber and Lyft drivers. There are so many of them that he writes just for them. Got picked up in 4 places. And I'm glad it got picked up in 4 places, because the feedback I got from each place was very different. From the first, the 538 side, these are statistics geeks, right? So guess what the questions were? They were nitpicking questions. Why 10% chance of failure? Why not 9.95%? Okay. I leave my spreadsheet open. So why don't you try putting in 9.95% and email me back there? 2 minutes later, the email comes. Now I see why you used 10%. It made no difference. So the first questions were all nitpicking questions. Very quickly they realized there's no point finessing the cost of capital to the second decimal point. It's not changing the value. The people on the Forbes blog loved it. They said, this is exactly the way they should be valuing companies. I'd even waste my time on their site, because they all pat you on the back and say, oh, amazing, this is how we should be doing things. Yeah. The TechCrunch guys absolutely hated what I did. Their reaction was, how dare you value one of ours? This this is a tech company. You bring this DCF stuff, get out of here, you know. And some of it was just plain abuse. But a lot of it was also stuff I would not know. I'm not a tech person, so they talked about the ride-sharing business and the reason it was so difficult for a newcomer to come into the business, how Uber was using data that I didn't know about. So I learned things about technology I wouldn't have learned. And the ride-sharing guy site was read by Uber drivers, and I discovered things about Uber I would never have known. They said this 80-20 mix is just for show. Here's what they do in LA. They give us 80%, but because they're competing with Lyft, at the end of the year, they kick back $2,000 to us if we've been driving all year. So they want to keep this facade of 80-20, but it's really closer to 88-12 or 90-10. Something I would never have known if I talked to just Uber management. And it all came to fruition on an evening about 2 weeks after I posted this on my blog. I was in Munich airport waiting for a connecting flight. My flight was delayed. So I did what I should never do, which is pull up my smartphone and start checking email, because I always run over my data limits doing this. And there's an email from a guy called Bill Gurley. For those of you who don't know Bill, he's actually a partner at Benchmark Capital, which was one of the first investors in Uber, an early investor, and he was actually in the board of directors for Uber. Does Bill know more about Uber than I do? Absolutely. So this is what the email said. He said, I read your blog post on Uber and I did not like it. I said, okay. He said, I've written a post on my blog taking issue with your blog post to blog post warfare, and I've said some mean things about you and I just wanted to let you know. So I closed the email. I have about an hour and a half left my flight, so guess where I go next? I goes to his blog, and here's how the headline reads. Damodaran misses by a mile. Get it? Uber drives misses by a mile. And he took issue with every part of my story. He said Uber is not just a car service company, it's a logistics company. Words have consequences, right? What is a logistics company? Anytime you have a challenge of moving a person or a thing from point A to point B, you see what he was saying? We're not just in car service, we could be in delivery, we could be in moving, we could be in any logistics business. Already are expanding the business. He said, we're not just urban, we're going to be everywhere. And he gave examples of suburban services that Uber was thinking about. He talked about a mom car. You know, across America, this is a little sexist, but it could be a dad car as well. Around 7 o'clock in the morning, there are these sleepy moms and dads who drag themselves out of the house. They get in the car, and a 6-year-old gets in the back of the car, and you drive to school and back. What an incredible inefficiency, right? So what Uber was planning was a mom car with a super mom who picks up 5 kids. So think of the 4. Of course, the super mom would have to do what moms ask in mom cars, which is, you're not just a transportation device, right? You have to ask questions like, did you remember to put your underwear on? Do you bring your books with you? How's Tim, who's been bullying you for the last 2 days? Is he let up on this? So the super mom will ask all these questions and keep things under check. He talked about a date car. I don't really want to go there, but I see mirrors on the ceiling in Vegas-type cars. No? He said, you don't want to drive on a date? We'll have a date car for you. So he gave examples of suburban services, and he also talked about the fact that he was going to try to link up Uber with credit card companies and airlines, so that when you flew from here to Jakarta, at the bottom of, right below your ticket, you allow you to reserve an Uber car. You see what he's building up to, a global networking benefit rather than a local network. I read it and I was fascinated. He thought I was going to be pissed off. I wrote him and said, do you want me to put a number on your story? He said, what are you talking about? I said, you've told a nice story. I can put a number on the story. Because in your story, what's different? Instead of a market of just car service, it's logistics at 300 billion instead of 100 billion. And instead of a 10% market share, you have a 40% market share because you've, and the value that you, so I sent him the value back, 53 billion. I said, do you like this? He said, a lot. And he said, oh, by the way, that 80-20 mix is going to be history soon. It's probably more likely to be 90-10. I said, not a problem. We went into my spreadsheet, changed 80-20 to 90-10, and I gave a value of 29 billion. Remember we talked about young companies, how your story drives valuation? In fact, I brought this all together towards the end of 2014 in a blog post, where I actually borrowed a premise from a Build-A-Bear store. You ever been to a Build-A-Bear store? These are these creepy little places in malls where you take your 8-year-old and they give them a piece of skin to stuff. And 35 minutes later, you've got the ugliest bear ever known to man, and the store says, you can just leave it behind or pay $75. Your 7-year-old is standing next to you, that's my bear, Dad. I love that bear, right? This is a great concept. I decided to steal it and make a build your own valuation of Uber, where I let people pick at each stage what they thought Uber was. So if you get a chance, go over to my blog. I actually lead you through. Do you think Uber is a transportation company, logistics company, car service company, or on-demand company? You're saying, what's an on-demand company? You want something in a hurry? The on-demand company will be there. You want a pizza in 15 minutes? It's there. You want to go to the bathroom, you're too lazy to get off the couch, the on-demand company will do it for you. It's a huge business. Does it have local networking benefits, global networking benefits, no networking benefits? And given the choices you made, I valued Uber anywhere from 800 million to more than 90 billion. Sounds absurd, but your story drives your valuation. So here's what I want you to think about before you get to the break. I want you to think about your story for your company. Okay? And I'm serious. Think about the story just like I did for Uber. It is actually what's going to make this valuation be a proactive valuation, because as your story changes, your value will change. When we get back from the break, we will talk about actually valuing companies. We actually haven't valued a single company so far. If you think about it all the way through, we're going to value total companies. So I will see you after the break. Have a good break. There's nothing that drives it. That is strength will play out here now. The cost structure is much more it will also mean that there will be a cost. These guys are truly reckless. Travis is reckless in his business decision that he was not arguing with the driver. Who knows what else he's done that market is big, but it's also much more ambitious. So a lot more moving parts, a lot more reinvestment now to get into the electric car business.
Right.
And all of those things are going to play out in your judgment.
Thank you so much.
Hello.
Good, thank you. How are you? I was wondering, I have like a little bit longer questions related to a project that I'm working on outside of the class. Are you going to be in your office around 4:45? Tomorrow? Okay. Yeah, tomorrow is Thursday. What time?
But that's good, because I'll be here usually from 9:30 to 9.
Okay, sounds
We usually run over there.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Bye.
So you're waiting for... I don't want to hold you. I just want to thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Good luck. Keep me posted on what you do.
I will.